Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. What we have for you today is another modification to a third generation Toyota 4Runner. It's another skid plate. Yay! More weight, less miles per gallon. Now I know what you're thinking. Haven't you pretty much covered everything you can put a skid plate on your third generation 4Runner yet? No, I haven't. There's the rear differential, and that is the lowest hanging point that can take some damage as you're four-wheeling. Now, ideally, you try to not go over really high rocks. You have your wheels track over the high points. But if you mess up or you're in an area where there's just a lot of rocks and the line you're picking is a line where potentially something could smash your rear end, having a skid plate on the differential is good for two reasons. Number one, it's going to protect your differential housing from getting gouged and maybe messing up your drain bolt, so it's going to be hard to get it off. If a big enough rock scrapes that and really hits it hard and you can't really get on there with a socket anymore. The other big one is if you have an e-locker, your e-locker motor, the actuator, is right there kind of in a vulnerable spot on the driver's side of the third member. If a rock hits that and you damage your motor, now you don't have a locking differential anymore. Now you might be saying, well, those rear axle housings are super beefy. Those things can take a hard hit. Yeah, you're right. They can take a pretty hard hit without any major damage to them other than getting them gouged up and potentially that drain plug being hard to get off. But your e-locker actuator can't really take a hard hit by a rock and not get damaged. The option I chose is a full differential skid as opposed to just a little skid plate that protects the motor. The pluses of having a differential skid is that it protects the differential housing and it protects the motor of the e-locker. The downside is you lose a little bit of clearance, and we're going to figure out what that loss of clearance is. We're going to take some measurements before and after and see actually how much clearance is lost in the rear end. The other downside to a full skid for the differential that protects the e-locker housing, it's more expensive than just getting the small little skid that protects the e-locker motor. The differential skid that I chose comes from Budbuilt. It's a really nicely built skid plate for the rear differential, and we're going to show you what that thing looks like now and all the hardware that came with it. It's going to connect in three spots. Right at the front here, and then on each side in the rear. One on that side, one on that side. The skid plate comes in bare metal, or you can buy a stainless steel option. I chose the bare metal option because it's more affordable. I cleaned it up first with some mineral spirits, and then I just chose this chassis roll bar paint that's a paint and primer. Makes it really easy to cover it and protect it. Now we'll show you the hardware that came with it. You have 7 bolts, 2 long ones, 2 medium length ones, and 3 short ones. And then you have 7 flat washers. You have this long bracket that affixes the skid plate on the front. And then you have 2 brackets, one on the passenger side rear and then one on the driver's side rear. We did a test fit and we found a problem with my application. I have a Sonoran steel lift, and part of the Sonoran steel lift is providing a parking brake lift bracket. So this effectively raises the parking brake from down here all the way up to here. It actually makes a pretty big difference. My parking brake works really well. I've seen other rigs that are lifted and don't have a lift bracket like this, and their parking brake does not work as well as mine does. If you have a lifted truck and you haven't lifted your parking brake in the rear, I highly suggest you do it. Here's the problem that we had. The L bracket that Budbuilt provides to attach the differential skid on the passenger side rear attaches to the same hole as the lift bracket does. We tried to put the lift bracket behind the L bracket. It didn't work for the holes to line up very well. We tried putting the lift bracket in front, and then the bolt heads interfered with each other, so that didn't work either. So the fix that I came up with is I decided to make a bracket that would incorporate the L bracket for the skid plate and the lift bracket for the parking brake. I went to a fab shop that's near my work, and they basically just made me a nice little L bracket, and they drilled the holes for me. If you can imagine, they drilled the holes in the same spots that the L bracket would be for the differential skid plate. And then this top hole on the Sonoran steel lift bracket is threaded. It's an M8 with a 125 pitch. And so they did the same thing for me. They drilled it and tapped it to an M8 with a 125 pitch. So now with this custom bracket, I'm going to be able to correctly attach the differential skid plate and maintain the lift bracket for the parking brake. The first thing we're doing is we want to see how much clearance we currently have from the lowest point to the ground. The lowest point is this edge of the area that encircles the drain plug, and the measurement that I have with my calipers is 7.6 millimeters. The 7.6 millimeters isn't from the ground there, it's just showing the gap between my calipers. That's the 7.6 millimeters, but it gives us a measurement to compare once we get the skid on. The skid plate is going to attach in two positions in the rear. It's going to attach right here. This is where the custom bracket that I made is going to go. It's going to go right here. So this is the attachment point on the driver's side. Right below the mount for the rear upper control arm on the passenger side, you have a brake line connection, and that's where the passenger side bracket's going to connect to. And then we'll show you where it's going to connect on the front when we get to it. All these fasteners are 12 millimeters, so I'm going to disconnect this brake line bracket on the passenger side first. The next thing I'm going to disconnect is this parking brake bracket right on the center of the differential. You want your parking brake off for this. It makes it easier to do this because you want this thing loose. You don't want tension on it, so have your parking brake off. If you have to, chalk your wheels so your truck doesn't roll around on you. And then lastly, this parking brake bracket one right here. Now we're going to get the skid plate slid underneath, jack it up, and start getting these brackets aligned with the axle housing. To start off with, we're going to get the brackets on the rear attached to the differential skid first. So I'm going to use one of the shorties with the flat washer on the passenger side bracket. And this is just going to be nice and loose, so I'll have a easier time lining up the threads on the axle housing. This passenger side bracket, it has threaded holes, so this is the orientation. You put the threaded holes behind these two, and then you put another shorty bolt with a washer on the front. And we're going to keep this side nice and loose too, so we'll have an easier time lining things up. So now we got to get this thing slid underneath. We're just using a basic hydraulic floor jack that you can get anywhere. We're going to get this parking brake cable behind. Now we're going to start jacking up on the jack. Now I'm going to use one of the medium length bolts with a flat washer. I'm going to attach the skid plate on this passenger side. When you're putting this thing in, the heads of the bolts come really close to each other, but they make it. Now you have to play pretend here. If you didn't have this specially made bracket that I made to incorporate the lift bracket for the parking brake, your bracket would stop right here and you would be attaching your parking brake right here. But since I have this lift bracket, I'm going to put my parking brake bracket on the very top. So I'm just going to use one of my old bolts that I have here. Okay, everything is still just hand tight right now. Now I'm going to work on getting this one connected right here. This was one of the little shorty 12 millimeters that I pulled out, and I'm going to use it again. Okay, that's hand tight. On the passenger side rear, the bracket's going to go behind the brake line. You have to line up the tab for the brake line. You're going to use this washer that has the flatten out section. If you didn't have that flatten out section, the full diameter washer would hit there, so that's why they did that. So you got to line up all these holes at the same time. Okay, this one's affixed. Now we have to go forward and we got to get the last bracket attached. The last bracket attaches the skid plate right on the front of the third member, right behind the drive shaft. I basically got this thing on my chest, and with it supported in the rear, it's really light. It's not really hard to manipulate. I'm gonna get the long bracket and I'm gonna place it right on top of here. I'm gonna grab one of my long bolts now with the washer, the longest ones. I'm gonna push the skid plate up against the third member, and then I'm gonna get one of the bolts started, like so. Then I'm gonna go on the opposite side and I'm gonna get the other one started. Now here's something to note. This bracket is not gonna meet up with the actual skid plate. It's not meant to do that. This bracket is really thick and probably could take a lot of force, but I have a feeling if you just went crazy and kept on tightening this, thinking you were gonna meet up this bracket with the skid plate, you might be able to do it, or maybe the threads would finally give way. All you're gonna have to do is just get this thing nice and snug to where it's not rattling around. An additional thing that I'm gonna do just to make it less likely that these bolts can back out is I'm gonna put a little bit of blue 242 Loctite to make the threads just a little bit stickier so they won't back out. So now all I have to do is grab a 13 millimeter. All these bolts that Budbuilt provided are 13 millimeter heads, and then I just got to go around and cinch everything up. So use your tool of choice. I have this nice little shorty gear wrench ratchet with a 13 millimeter socket. You can use a box end or open end wrench, whatever you got at your disposal. So I'm just gonna cinch these up a little bit and cinch them up evenly. I'm just cinching these up with the same shorty little ratchet with the 13 millimeter socket. Again, these bolt heads are really tight to each other, but you can still kind of get on there. This one's not going to let me get on there with the socket, so I'm going to have to do that with the open end wrench. I'll go ahead and tighten this one on the passenger side. I'll tighten these up. This one I'm just going to tighten up with this open end wrench. We got to tighten up this 12 millimeter bolt for the parking brake bracket. And then we have to tighten up the bracket for the parking brake bracket here. If you just had the little L bracket, this bracket would actually be down here. And that one's tight. If you have a lift, I can't recommend it any higher that you get a bracket, whether you make one or you buy one from Sonoran Steel. But like I said, if you're gonna get this skid plate and you have a lifted truck, make yourself a bracket like I did, just a longer L bracket that incorporates this section and then the lift for the parking brake, and then you'll be good. So now we're gonna take a measurement and see how much clearance we lost for the rear axle housing with this skid plate on. Remember, with this caliper tool, I was able to get it underneath the lowest point, which was that ring that goes around the differential drain plug, and I was able to open up the caliper 7.6 millimeters. That's the measurement I took as a reference for the before and after. Even closing the caliper all the way, I can't get it underneath the differential skid plate. I'm going to take the measurement just with the tape measure. So I'm going to get the caliper out of the way. I'm going to get the tape measure down against the ground, and then I'm going to measure to the bottom of the skid plate, and it looks like it's perfectly at 23 centimeters. So now I'm going to get a value for the previous measurement before we put the skid plate on. I have my caliper tool opened up to 7.6 millimeters, and I'm going to measure from the top to the bottom. It comes out at 24.5 centimeters. So that's how much clearance we had before the skid plate was put on, 24.5 centimeters. So 24.5 centimeters was the clearance before the skid plate, 23 centimeters was the clearance with the skid plate on. Doing some simple subtraction, we have a difference of 1.5 centimeters or 0.6 inches. So I would have to say that Budbuilt did a pretty good job building this thing with limiting the amount of clearance loss. 0.6 inches is not that bad, and I think it's a fair trade-off for the additional protection you have for your rear axle housing and your e-locker actuator. Here's what the final result looks like. This is a shot from the front looking towards the rear. You can see how nicely it protects the differential. The big one for me is your e-locker housing is right up above here, and you can see that it protects the e-locker actuator really nicely the way Bud built this. Here's what it looks like from the rear. This is the passenger side. You can see that he actually has a cutout so you can get at the fill hole. Here's what it looks like from the bottom. And then this is what it looks like on the driver's side. Alrighty then, we are done with this job. Getting the skid plate on is pretty straightforward. You got two brackets in the rear, you got the bracket in the front. You utilize a hydraulic jack unless you're really strong and you can curl that thing up there while you're getting things connected. I don't highly recommend that unless you want to work out. Use a hydraulic jack, whether it's a transmission jack or a regular hydraulic floor jack. Jack it up there, get all your fasteners that you have to release, get the brackets on there, you're good to go. The main hiccup is if you have that Sonoran steel lift bracket, and like I said, I highly recommend if you don't have one and you have a lifted truck, definitely get some type of lift bracket. Make yourself a longer L bracket so the skid plate will work with the lift bracket. Whether you have a shop do it for you or you just do it yourself, it's up to you. I now have another cool skid plate that people are going to notice while they're following me through the speed bumps at the mall. Totally envious of my Budbuilt differential skid plate. I know Sean's envious. I could see it in his eyes. Maybe we'll get one for Sean too. But seriously, the reason why I opted to get the Budbuilt skid plate as opposed to just a little protector for the e-locker actuator is I figured that it's the best of both worlds. It's going to protect your axle housing from a hit, and it's going to protect the e-locker motor. If it protects my axle housing from breaking from a rock, or it protects my e-locker motor one time, it's paid for itself. So it's up to you. I recommend it, but if you're short on money and you're just worried about the e-locker actuator taking a hit, then go for one of those more affordable protectors just for the e-locker actuator and save yourself some money. It's up to you. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We'll be back with more videos. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye.